In September 1941, a quiet ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv became a slaughterhouse. Over 2 haunting days, Nazi Einsatzgruppen, aided by collaborators, marched thousands of Jews to Babi Yar, stripped them of their belongings, and executed them in mass gunfire. The earth itself became their grave, silencing over 33,000 lives in a single massacre. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 26, 1941, under the name Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military campaign in history. More than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by units from Allied nations, surged across the border with a single aim: to destroy the Soviet Union in a lightning campaign. As the Wehrmacht advanced, cities fell one after another, and with their occupation came the shadow of the Nazi racial policy. In every town and captured territory, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads of the SS, followed closely behind the army, carrying out mass shootings and extermination operations against Jews, Roma, political commissars, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Kyiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, stood as a critical target. Strategically positioned on the Dnieper River, it was a vital hub for transportation, industry, and Soviet military operations. By late September 1941, after a massive encirclement known as the Battle of Kyiv, the German forces had achieved one of the most devastating victories of the war. More than 600 Zarosn Soviet troops were captured in the encirclement, marking it as one of the largest surrenders in military history. The city itself lay open to German occupation, and with its fall came the fate of its large Jewish community, numbering approximately 160,000 before the invasion. Life in occupied Kyiv was immediately marked by repression. German authorities imposed harsh military rule, demanding obedience and punishing resistance with brutal reprisals. The civilian population faced shortages of food and supplies as the invaders took control of resources. For the Jews of Kyiv, the situation was far more perilous. Nazi ideology had already predetermined their fate, and in the weeks before Kyiv's fall, Einsatzgruppe C, commanded by S. Brigadefuhrer Otto Rasch, had already carried out mass shootings across western Ukraine. In towns like Zhytomyr, Berdychev, and Vinnytsia, tens of thousands of Jews had been executed, often in fields, forests, or ravines. Kyiv, with its size and prominence, would soon witness one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. In late September 1941, an event occurred that served as a trigger for mass reprisal. On September 24, a series of powerful explosions ripped through the city center, destroying buildings along Kreshchetik, Kyiv's main street. The blasts, set by retreating Soviet NKVD operatives before the German occupation, caused massive fires that raged for days. Hundreds of German soldiers and civilians were killed or injured, and large portions of central Kyiv were left in ruins. In response, the German military command sought swift and decisive retribution. The Jewish population was singled out as the target, accused collectively of complicity in the sabotage, though in reality they had no involvement. The decision was made to eliminate Kyiv's Jews in a single, coordinated operation. On September 28, 1941, the German authorities issued an order to the Jews of Kyiv. Notices were posted across the city, written in Russian, Ukrainian, and German. They instructed all Jews to gather on the morning of September 29 at a designated location near the Lukyanivska Cemetery, carrying documents, valuables, and warm clothing. They were told they would be resettled. The order warned that anyone failing to appear would be shot. The deception was deliberate, intended to prevent panic and ensure compliance. Many Jews believed they were being deported, a fate already terrible. But few could imagine the scale of the horror awaiting them. On the morning of September 29, thousands of Jewish men, women, and children began making their way through the streets of Kyiv. Families carried bundles of clothing, food, and personal possessions, walking toward the gathering point. Eyewitnesses later recalled the eerie silence that accompanied the columns of people, broken only by the sounds of footsteps and the cries of children. German soldiers and Ukrainian auxiliaries lined the route, herding the crowd onward with rifles and whips. The procession stretched for miles, an endless stream of humanity moving toward an unknown destiny. The destination was Babi Yar, a deep ravine on the northwestern edge of the city, near the cemetery and a military camp. The ravine, nearly 2.5 kilometers long and up to 50 meters deep, would soon become a mass grave. The operation was meticulously planned. Einsatzgruppe C, along with Police Regiment South, units of the Waffen, SS, and local collaborators, were assigned to carry out the executions. Machine guns, ammunition, and equipment were prepared in advance, and cordons were set up to prevent escape. The scale of the operation required efficiency, and every step was organized to ensure the swift elimination of tens of thousands of people. As the victims arrived, they were directed to a series of checkpoints. First, they were ordered to hand over identity papers and valuables, stripping them of money, jewelry, and personal belongings. Next, they were forced to remove their coats, shoes, and other clothing. Soldiers and auxiliaries beat those who hesitated, driving them forward with shouts and blows. The victims, now stripped of possessions and dignity, were led down paths toward the ravine itself. At the edge, groups of men, women, and children were forced to lie face down on the ground in layers. Executioners stood above them with machine guns, firing into their bodies. The corpses fell into the ravine, and new victims were brought forward to lie atop them. Again and again, the guns roared, filling the air with the sound of death. The killing continued without pause, efficient and relentless. By the end of September 29, thousands of Jews had already been murdered. The executions resumed the next day, September 30, following the same brutal pattern. Estimates vary, but in those 2 days alone, 771 Jews were executed at Babi Yar, a figure meticulously recorded by the perpetrators themselves in reports sent back to Berlin. The massacre was one of the largest single mass shootings of the Holocaust, a moment when an entire community was virtually annihilated in the span of 48 hours. Yet the killings at Babi Yar did not end with those 2 days. Over the following months and years, the ravine continued to serve as a killing ground. Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, and others accused of resistance were brought to Babi Yar and executed. By the end of the German occupation, the total number of victims buried in the ravine is estimated to have exceeded 100,000. Each execution was carried out with the same cold efficiency, adding layer upon layer of human remains to the earth. The massacre was carried out with the participation not only of German SS and police units, but also with the assistance of local collaborators. Ukrainian auxiliaries, recruited by the occupiers, played a role in guarding, escorting, and even shooting victims. The collaboration was not universal, as many Ukrainians also suffered under Nazi rule, but the involvement of local forces was crucial in enabling the operation's scale and speed. The dynamic of occupation, fear, and opportunism contributed to the unfolding of mass murder in Kyiv and elsewhere across occupied Eastern Europe. Life in Kyiv after the massacre was transformed by the absence of its Jewish population. Homes, belongings, and properties were seized by the occupiers, redistributed to soldiers and collaborators. The city itself remained under strict German control, its population reduced and cowed by the brutality of occupation. The fear instilled by the massacre was a deliberate tactic, a warning of the fate awaiting anyone who resisted German authority. For those who survived in hiding, often aided by courageous neighbors, the memory of Babi Yar was an ever-present terror, a reminder of the fragility of life under the Nazi regime. The massacre at Babi Yar was part of a broader pattern of mass shootings that characterized the early phase of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Before the establishment of extermination camps in occupied Poland, the Einsatzgruppen carried out what has been described as the Holocaust by bullets. Between 1941 and 1943, more than 1.5 million Jews were murdered in this manner, executed in fields, forests, and ravines across Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Russia. Babi Yar stood as one of the most infamous examples, its scale and speed shocking even within the context of widespread atrocity. As the war turned against Germany and the Red Army advanced westward, the Nazis attempted to conceal evidence of their crimes. In 1943, as Soviet forces approached Kyiv, the Germans forced prisoners from a nearby concentration camp to exhume bodies from the Ravine and burn them on pyres of wood and fuel. The work was grueling and horrific, carried out under constant guard. The attempt to erase the traces of mass murder was only partially successful, as countless witnesses, documents, and physical evidence remained. When the Soviets liberated Kyiv in November 1943, they uncovered the scale of the atrocities at Babi Yar, adding it to the long list of crimes committed during the German occupation. In the aftermath of the war, the memory of Babi Yar was shaped by political and cultural forces. The Soviet government, while documenting Nazi atrocities, often downplayed the specifically Jewish nature of the massacre, framing the victims as generic Soviet citizens. This policy of silence and suppression lasted for decades, leaving survivors and relatives without recognition of the true nature of the tragedy. It was only later, through literature, testimony, and memorialization efforts, that the full story of Babi Yar came to light. Writers and poets gave voice to the silence, ensuring that the ravine would be remembered as more than just a site of death, but as a symbol of the human cost of hatred and war. The story of Babi Yar remains one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust and of human history. The massacre illustrates the speed with which entire communities could be destroyed, the machinery of state and ideology turning ordinary landscapes into killing fields. The ravine that once echoed with the sounds of life became a grave for tens of thousands, its soil forever bearing the memory of those who perished. When the gunfire finally ceased on September 30, 1941, the ravine of Babi Yar had been transformed into a chasm filled with bodies. The killing had lasted 2 days, but its echoes would reverberate for years. In Kyiv, silence followed. The notices that had once commanded the Jews to report disappeared, their purpose fulfilled. Homes once filled with families stood abandoned, their doors broken, their windows dark. The belongings left behind were swiftly looted or redistributed. German officers moved into confiscated apartments, while valuables taken from the victims were shipped back to the Reich. The absence was immediate and overwhelming, a void carved into the city's social fabric. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, their streets stripped not only of people but of language, tradition, and culture that had existed in Kyiv for centuries. The ravine itself did not rest. Even after the massacre of the Jews of Kyiv, Babi Yar continued to serve as an execution site. In the following weeks, groups of Roma families were brought there, accused of being vagrants or spies, and met the same fate as the Jews. Soviet prisoners of war, captured in the hundreds of thousands during the encirclement battles, were executed in smaller numbers but with brutal efficiency, their bodies also discarded into the yawning ravine. Resistance members, suspected partisans, and ordinary civilians accused of defiance were marched to the same destination. The ravine became a place of perpetual death, its earth layered with victims of different backgrounds, but bound together by the violence of occupation. By the spring of 1942, the killings numbered in the tens of thousands beyond the initial massacre, and Babi Yar was already infamous among the local population as a place from which no one returned. The machinery of the killings was ruthless but methodical. Units of Einsatzgruppen C, police battalions, and German military police worked in coordination, aided by Ukrainian auxiliaries trained by the occupiers. These auxiliaries guarded prisoners, blocked escape routes, and at times participated in the shootings themselves. Victims were marched in groups, stripped of their possessions, and forced into the same ritual of death that had been perfected during the September massacre. The sound of gunfire from the ravine became an all too familiar background to daily life in Kyiv. Residents in surrounding neighborhoods could hear the shots, see the smoke, and smell the stench that rose from the depths of the ravine, yet fear and repression silenced them. Speaking of it could invite suspicion, and suspicion could lead to the same fate. Among those who perished at Babi Yar were not only Jews and Roma, but also significant numbers of Soviet intelligentsia and cultural figures. In 1941, the renowned Ukrainian actress Maria Karpovich and the celebrated poet Lev Kvitko were executed at the Ravine. In 1942, members of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, were killed there as well, accused of working against German rule. Later, in 1943, members of the underground resistance who had tried to organize sabotage against German forces were brought to the same site and shot. The ravine absorbed not only individuals but also the intellectual, artistic, and political life of Kyiv, burying it beneath layers of earth and silence. The German occupation of Kyiv was characterized by both exploitation and terror. The city became a garrison town, supplying resources and manpower for the German war effort. Food shortages grew severe as rations were cut and much of the agricultural produce was seized. Forced labor was imposed on the population, with thousands of civilians deported to work in factories and farms deep inside Germany. Surveillance was constant, and punishments for even minor infractions were brutal. Public executions, floggings, and arrests created an atmosphere of fear. In this climate, the massacre at Babi Yar was not only an act of extermination but also a warning to the living, a demonstration of the absolute power held by the occupiers. By 1942, the pattern of mass shootings across occupied Eastern Europe had been established as part of the Holocaust by bullets. The Einsatzgruppen, together with police battalions, were carrying out systematic extermination operations across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. In places like Kharkiv, Odessa, and Minsk, Jews were rounded up, marched to killing sites, and executed in mass graves. Babi Yar, however, remained distinctive for the sheer number of victims concentrated in a single location. While extermination camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz would later come to symbolize the industrial scale of the Holocaust, ravines like Babi Yar bore witness to its earlier phase, when the weapon of choice was not gas chambers, but bullets fired into unarmed crowds. As the war dragged on and German fortunes began to shift, Babi Yar's role as a killing site continued. In 1942 and 1943, smaller groups were executed, their deaths adding to the already immense toll. Among them were thousands of psychiatric patients taken from hospitals in Kyiv and the surrounding region, deemed unfit for life by Nazi ideology. They were driven to the ravine, shot, and buried with the others. Soviet prisoners of war, weakened by starvation and disease in makeshift camps, were also brought to Babi Yar for execution when they were no longer deemed useful. The ravine became not only a burial ground but a symbol of Nazi policy, where any group judged undesirable could be eliminated. By the summer of 1943, the tide of war had turned. The German defeat at Stalingrad and the massive tank battle at Kursk had put the Wehrmacht on the defensive. Soviet forces began advancing westward, reclaiming territory that had been under occupation since 1941. With each retreat, the Germans sought to cover their tracks, concealing evidence of mass murder to deny accountability. Orders were issued under Aktion 1005, a directive to exhume and destroy the bodies buried in mass graves. At Babi Yar, this order was carried out in August 1943. German authorities assembled a special prisoner unit composed of Soviet prisoners of war and inmates from the Seretz concentration camp, located near the ravine. Chained together, these men were forced to dig into the earth and exhume the decomposing corpses buried since 1941. The work was grueling and revolting. For weeks, under constant guard, the prisoners disinterred bodies, stacked them onto wooden pyres built with railroad tracks, and burned them with gasoline and oil. Day after day, the ravine was filled with smoke and the smell of charred remains as the Germans attempted to obliterate the evidence of their crimes. The corpses were so numerous that the prisoners often worked around the clock, dragging bones and bodies from the ground in a desperate race against time. The prisoners knew that once their task was completed, they too would be executed to ensure silence. Realizing this, a group of them planned a desperate escape. On the night of September 29, 1943, exactly 2 years after the massacre had begun, the prisoners rose against their guards. In the darkness, using improvised weapons, they attacked, cut their chains, and fled into the surrounding woods. Out of nearly 300 prisoners forced to work at Babi Yar, only a handful managed to escape successfully, but their testimonies would later provide crucial evidence of what had occurred in the ravine. By November 1943, Soviet troops re-entered Kyiv after months of fierce fighting. What they found was a city scarred by occupation and a ravine whose earth still bore the signs of atrocity. Though the Germans had attempted to erase the evidence, the ground of Babi Yar revealed charred remains, bones, and ash. Survivors and witnesses came forward, telling of the notices posted in September 1941, of the endless procession of families forced toward the ravine, and of the sound of gunfire that had filled the air. Soviet investigators documented the crime as part of broader war crimes inquiries, gathering evidence to present at future trials. Photographs were taken, reports compiled, and testimonies preserved, ensuring that Babi Yar's story could not be buried completely. Yet in the immediate post-war years, the memory of Babi Yar was shaped by political realities. The Soviet Union, while condemning Nazi crimes, chose to portray the victims primarily as Soviet citizens rather than as Jews, downplaying the specifically anti-Semitic character of the massacre. Official reports listed numbers of victims, but avoided acknowledgement of the Jewish identity of the majority. For survivors, this policy meant that their suffering remained unspoken in official discourse. Families who had lost loved ones were left without recognition of the full truth. The ravine itself, unmarked by any memorial, remained a silent scar on the edge of Kyiv. In 1946, during the Nuremberg trials, reports from Einsatzgruppen units were presented as evidence of systematic mass shootings. Among them was the operational report from Einsatzgruppe C that listed 33, 771 Jews executed in Kyiv over 2 days in September 1941. This number, precise and chilling, stood as one of the most detailed records of mass murder during the Holocaust. Yet even with such evidence, Babi Yar remained absent from much of the public narrative for years. The Cold War era deepened the silence, as Soviet authorities resisted efforts to single out Jewish suffering, fearing it might undermine the unity of the Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Despite official silence, voices continued to emerge. Survivors who had escaped the massacre or who had lived through the occupation told their stories privately, passing them down through families. In the 1960s, the Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko broke through the wall of silence with his poem, Babi Yar, condemning the absence of a memorial and the suppression of truth. His words inspired the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, who incorporated the poem into his 13th symphony. These cultural works drew international attention to the massacre, forcing acknowledgement of what had long been hidden. The ravine, once silenced by fear, began to speak again through literature and art. The number of victims buried in Babi Yar remained contested for decades, but historians estimate that more than 100,000 people were executed there between 1941 and 1943. The massacre of September 29 and 30, 1941, when 771 Jews were killed, was only the beginning of a 2-year campaign of executions that turned the ravine into one of the largest mass graves of the Second World War. The earth of Babi Yar, churned by bullets, shovels, and fire, held the remains of entire families, whole communities, and countless lives that were extinguished in the span of a breath. The ravine became more than a geographical feature. It was a symbol of the destructive power of ideology and war, a place where thousands of voices were silenced, but whose story could never be completely erased. The silence that followed was filled, in time with testimony, memory, and the demand for remembrance, ensuring that the tragedy of Babi Yar would not remain buried beneath the soil that had once swallowed it whole. The liberation of Kyiv in November 1943 brought the Soviet army face to face with the remnants of Nazi terror. Babi Yar, once a quiet ravine on the outskirts of the city, revealed the scale of atrocity left behind by the retreating Germans. Even after the forced exhumations and burning of corpses under Aktion Tanzantano 5, the site bore the remnants of the countless lives destroyed, bones ash, and fragments of clothing surfaced from the earth, evidence of what had occurred just 2 years earlier. Soviet investigators documented the scene meticulously, taking photographs, measuring mass graves, and recording witness testimonies. Survivors who had escaped the September 1941 massacre recounted the chilling sequence of events, the notices summoning them under false pretenses, the long march through Kyiv streets, the beating, the stripping of belongings, and the relentless machine, gunfire. These testimonies, collected in the months following liberation, provided a precise record of the horror. The city itself struggled to comprehend the enormity of the massacre. Streets that once teemed with life were now populated by an uneasy mix of returning residents, Soviet troops, and displaced persons. Buildings that had been abandoned or looted were slowly repopulated, yet the absence of entire families was stark. Survivors described the devastation not just in physical terms, but in the loss of social and cultural life. Jewish businesses, schools, synagogues, and homes had vanished. The intricate fabric of Kyiv's Jewish community, centuries old, had been torn apart in a matter of hours. Families that had survived in hiding returned to find homes taken, property confiscated, and the traces of neighbors obliterated. Efforts to memorialize Babi Yar in the immediate post-war period were complicated by political considerations. The Soviet Union sought to frame the horrors of the Nazi occupation within a broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War, emphasizing the suffering of Soviet citizens as a whole rather than focusing on the specifically Jewish character of many of the victims. Initial memorials erected at Babi Yar in the late 1940s and early 1950s were modest, often referencing Soviet citizens rather than Jews. Plaques and markers were placed along the ravine's edge, but they lacked names, details, or acknowledgement of the specific communities destroyed there. Families and survivors were left with incomplete recognition, and for decades, the story of Babi Yar remained partially hidden within official histories. Despite official silence, the ravine became a site of memory for those who survived. In private, families and friends gathered to commemorate the dead, marking anniversaries with quiet gatherings, prayers, and storytelling. Oral histories passed down within families preserved the sequence of events, the initial roundup, the march through Kyiv, the screams of those forced to lie in the ravine, the sound of gunfire, and the endless procession of victims. These accounts were invaluable in preserving the personal dimensions of the tragedy, detailing the human experiences that statistics alone could not convey. The suppression of public acknowledgement was challenged by cultural and literary interventions. In 1961, the Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko published the poem Babi Yar, breaking decades of enforced silence. His words condemned not only the massacre, but also the failure to recognize the victims as Jews, highlighting the absence of a memorial and the ongoing erasure of memory. The poem resonated across the Soviet Union and internationally, attracting attention from scholars, journalists, and activists. Dmitri Shostakovich later set the poem to music in his 13th Symphony, amplifying its reach and cementing Babi Yar in cultural memory. These artistic works provided a moral and historical reckoning, drawing attention to a site that had been ignored by the authorities for decades. By the 1970s and 1980s, renewed efforts to establish formal memorials at Babi Yar emerged. Jewish organizations, survivors' groups, and sympathetic cultural figures pressed the Soviet government to recognize the massacre's specific Jewish character. In 1976, a wooden cross was erected to commemorate the victims of the September 1941 massacre, followed by the installation of several plaques marking different groups executed there, including Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and Ukrainian partisans. However, full recognition of the Jewish victims was still limited under Soviet policy, and much of the focus remained generalized. Nevertheless, these steps marked the beginning of a broader movement to ensure that the memory of Babi Yar would not fade. As archival research expanded in the late 20th century, historians pieced together the full scope of the atrocities. Einsatzgruppen reports, German military records, and survivor testimonies revealed the meticulous planning behind the massacre, the role of local collaborators, and the staggering number of victims. Einsatzgruppen's report, which listed 771 Jews executed over 2 days, became a central reference point for scholars. Additional research confirmed that over the 2 years following September 1941, more than 100,000 people were executed at Babi Yar, encompassing Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and others. The historical record made clear that Babi Yar was not an isolated event, but part of a systematic program of extermination carried out by Nazi forces in occupied Eastern Europe. The post-Soviet period allowed for more open and inclusive commemoration. After Ukraine gained independence in 1991, efforts were made to establish a comprehensive memorial complex at Babi Yar. Monuments were constructed to honor Jews, Roma, and other victims, and plaques were installed with the names of those killed. Annual commemorative events drew survivors, descendants, scholars, and diplomats from around the world. Educational programs were developed to teach the history of Babi Yar, ensuring that future generations could learn from the atrocities committed there. Museums, memorials, and historical research projects now stand alongside the Ravine, preserving both the memory of the victims and the evidence of the crimes committed. Babi Yar has also become a focal point for understanding the broader mechanisms of the Holocaust by bullets. Scholars have studied the logistical and operational methods employed by the Einsatzgruppen, examining how coordination between SS units, police battalions, and local collaborators enabled the mass executions. The meticulous record, keeping by the perpetrators, including reports sent to Berlin detailing numbers, locations, and procedures, allows historians to reconstruct events with remarkable precision. These studies have illuminated not only the scale of killing, but also the mindset and ideology driving the perpetrators, highlighting the intersection of military occupation and racial extermination policy. Survivor testimonies continue to deepen the understanding of Babi Yar. Individuals who managed to escape the ravine or survive in hiding have recounted in detail the moments leading up to the massacre, the fear that gripped entire families, the forced separation of men, women, and children, and the desperate attempts to flee. Others describe the aftermath, the shock of discovering that friends and neighbors had vanished, the struggle to locate family members, and the trauma that persisted long after the gunfire had ended. These personal accounts provide an essential complement to archival records, conveying the human dimension of the tragedy in ways that statistics cannot. The legacy of Babi Yar is also evident in contemporary memorialization and scholarship. Annual commemorations on September 29 mark the anniversary of the massacre, with religious services, cultural programs, and public ceremonies honoring the victims. Scholars continue to study the site, publishing research on the operational methods of the killers, the identities and fates of the victims, and the role of local collaboration. Educational programs in Ukraine and abroad incorporate Babi Yar into broader curricula on the Holocaust, and emphasizing both its historical specificity and its universal lessons about the dangers of hatred and totalitarianism. International recognition of Babi Yar has grown as well. Monuments and memorials have been visited by foreign dignitaries, diplomats, and scholars. Exhibitions in museums across Europe and North America include Babi Yar among the sites that illustrate the early phases of the Holocaust. Through these efforts, the story of Babi Yar has moved beyond local memory, becoming part of global awareness of the crimes committed during the Second World War. The ravine itself, once a site of silence and terror, now serves as a place of reflection, remembrance, and education. In literature and art, Babi Yar continues to inspire works that confront the scale of human atrocity. Beyond Yevtushenko and Shostakovich, writers, poets, and filmmakers have explored the massacre, dramatizing the experiences of victims and survivors. These works do not merely recount events, they evoke the atmosphere of terror, the psychological impact of mass murder, and the enduring challenge of bearing witness. Through storytelling, the memory of Babi Yar transcends geography and time, transforming from a site of physical atrocity into a symbol of historical consciousness and moral reckoning. Babi Yar's significance extends beyond the immediate history of Kyiv or the Holocaust by bullets. It represents the catastrophic consequences of ideological extremism, the vulnerability of communities under occupation, and the systematic nature of industrialized mass murder. The massacre demonstrates how ordinary locations, ravines, fields, and forests can become sites of profound human destruction, and how the coordination of military, police, and local forces can facilitate crimes of unimaginable scale. It also illustrates the resilience of memory, showing how individuals, families, and societies can struggle to preserve truth and honor those lost even in the face of denial or suppression. The story of Babi Yar also underscores the importance of historical documentation. From the meticulous reports of the Einsatzgruppen to survivor testimonies collected decades later, the accumulation of evidence has enabled historians to reconstruct the events with accuracy. Photographs, archival materials, and physical traces at the site provide tangible proof of what occurred, ensuring that the massacre cannot be dismissed or forgotten. The careful preservation of these records serves both as a tool for scholarly research and as a safeguard against denial or distortion. Even today, the lessons of Babi Yar resonate. Scholars and educators emphasize the massacre as an example of how prejudice, bureaucracy, and authoritarian power can combine to produce catastrophic violence. The systematic planning, the complicity of collaborators, and the scale of killing reveal the mechanisms through which genocide is enacted. Commemorative events and memorials not only honor the victims, but also reinforce the moral imperative to remember, educate, and prevent similar atrocities in the future. Babi Yar stands as a stark reminder that history carries enduring responsibilities, and that silence or forgetfulness is a dangerous companion to injustice. As Kyiv has rebuilt and modernized over the decades, Babi Yar remains both a historical site and a place of reflection. Walking along the edge of the ravine, visitors encounter monuments, plaques, and memorial installations commemorating the victims of the massacre. The depth of the ravine, once filled with the cries of those executed, now echoes with silence, contemplation, and remembrance. Educational tours, guided by historians and survivors' descendants, recount the events of September 1941 and the following years, emphasizing both the human tragedy and the broader historical context. The site has become a focal point for reflection on the Holocaust, the Second World War, and the moral lessons derived from history. The legacy of Babi Yar endures because of the combined efforts of survivors, scholars, artists, and educators who have fought to preserve its memory. From clandestine testimonies during the Soviet era to internationally recognized memorials in the present day, the story of the ravine has been told across generations. Its victims, numbering over 100,000, continue to be honored through ceremonies, literature, music, and historical research. The ravine, once a symbol of unspeakable terror, now serves as a place of witness, ensuring that the atrocities committed there remain visible and understood. Babi Yar, in the end, represents both the depths of human cruelty and the enduring power of remembrance. The massacre of September 29 to 30, 1941, and the subsequent killings over the following 2 years exemplify the systematic execution of Nazi racial policies, the complicity of occupying forces, and the devastating impact on local communities. Yet through memory, testimony, and cultural reflection, Babi Yar has been transformed from a site of concealment into a place of historical consciousness. Its story, preserved in records, art, and education, stands as a testament to the victims and as a warning to future generations. The ravine itself, stretching across the outskirts of Kyiv, remains a silent guardian of history. Trees grow where once thousands fell, and the ground bears the weight of countless lives extinguished. Visitors pause, reflect, and remember, confronted with the enormity of human loss and the cruelty that made it possible. The narrative of Babi Yar is no longer merely a local or historical event. It is a universal story of humanity's capacity for both destruction and remembrance. Through meticulous documentation, survivor accounts, memorialization, and cultural representation, the ravine continues to speak across decades, ensuring that the victims' voices, silenced in life, resonate through history. Babi Yar's story concludes not in the violence that created it, but in the enduring power of memory. The site remains a place where history is preserved, where the lessons of the Holocaust are taught, and where generations are reminded of the fragility of human life under tyranny. From the mass shootings of September 1941 to the ongoing commemoration and scholarship of today, Babi Yar embodies both tragedy and testimony. The ravine, once a chasm of death, has become a profound symbol of historical witness, demanding that the world remember, reflect, and learn.